Today I'm really happy and excited to be speaking with Dr. Moira Jenkins, someone whose work I've been following for quite a long time. I've kind of been academically stalking her, not stalking her in any other sense of the word. Moira's got an amazing background. She's a clinical psychologist. She has lots of qualifications, including a PhD in really the more challenging aspects of workplace conflict, looking at things like bullying and discrimination and harassment, high conflict, mental health related matters. She's the director of Aboto, an organisation specialising in workplace conflict. But at the moment, that's kind of on hold because Moira is currently the mayor of Victor Harbor in South Australia. And the main reason that I've asked Moira to come and speak with me today is because I absolutely love this book of hers, the Preventing and Managing Workplace Bullying and Harassment, which I believe was a book that you put together based on your PhD research.
Some of it's based on my PhD research, but some of it's also based along a lot of the training that I've done with organisations and the questions that they ask and the tools that I use in the training, because training around bullying and sexual harassment, I've been to some workshops that are as boring as anything. You know, you'd rather slap your face with a wet fish, but I've been to others that are really engaging. And so I tend to, you know, if I really like something, then I'll use it or adapt it, and I'll put those sorts of things in the book to help trainers and HR professionals to really get that training engaging for the people that are doing it.
So a lot of my clients and my students, my graduates, get a little anxious when they're thinking about working as a conflict management professional, whether it's a conflict management coach or a mediator or some other consultant, where an allegation of bullying comes up, whether or not it's something that people are calling bullying or whether it's actual bullying. It creates a bit of anxiety for practitioners because it seems like a risky space to get into. And so I wondered if today we could talk to you a little bit about some ideas that you might have for practitioners going into that sort of space, things they might need to look out for, things that they might do a bit differently than your sort of standard, office workplace conflict. And to start off with, I wondered if you could explain to us, what is bullying? You know, that word is used all the time to describe all sorts of things, but when you talk about workplace bullying, what does it mean to you?
Sure, and I think you've really hit a really important point, Sam, because bullying is an umbrella term that people use quite colloquially to describe a whole lot of bad behaviour. And if I, call you names or do something that you don't like that upsets you, then often you'll then call me a bully, when in fact that may be bullying behaviour in terms of behaviour that's humiliating or victimising, or it makes you feel upset, but it may not necessarily be bullying as described in the industrial relations definition or in a definition. And bullying is also used as a way, if I go to HR with a complaint about having conflict with somebody, then that might not be treated as seriously as I'd like. But if I say somebody's bullying me, then that's a red flag and that will be treated. It was interesting, a long time ago, there was a classic study that was done by, I think, Lifco and Mackenzie Davies. And they asked a group of people, they gave people a definition of bullying, all right? So a typical definition, so that as repeated behaviour that's targeting you, that is victimising, humiliating, or that a reasonable person would see as victimising or humiliating, and that could end up as a risk to your health or safety. And they asked this group of employees, who had been subjected to that behaviour according to that definition over the last, year, I think it was. And of those that put up their hand and said yes, they then took them aside and interviewed them to find out a bit more about that behaviour. And what they found was that a lot of the behaviour that people had said, yes, that's definitely bullying, according to that definition, it was not bullying. It was people annoyed with people repeatedly parking their car in their car park. It was being angry with organisational policies or procedures that they actually didn't like. They were angry with poor performance management. That might not have been perfect performance management, might not have been good performance management, but they labelled it as bullying. So we know that people call all sorts of things bullying when it is not. And so some of the advice that I give to people when they receive a complaint of bullying is actually look at the behaviours, take away that label and look at the behaviours that are occurring. And when we look at the different types of bullying, the most common type of bullying is that conflict escalation bullying, when you have two people in an argument that won't let go of that argument, that they don't want a win-win position. They don't want to get underneath those positions to the interests and really find out what's going on. And so that argument really starts escalating, and you then start seeing that conflict becoming much more targeted and victimizing and humiliating and targeting that soft belly of the other person. The first person to go to HR and say, I'm being bullied, is labelled the complainant, the target, the victim, oh, you poor thing, that's terrible. The other person is labelled the bully, the respondent, the perpetrator, oh, you nasty, horrible person. But when you actually look at the behaviour, both parties are behaving badly. And so it's really important to look at the behaviours rather than just look at that label. Absolutely, you can get bullying that is per the definition, that is awful, victimising, humiliating behaviour that should not be tolerated, that is inappropriate for mediation, that needs to be investigated and then actually some sort of determination made and consequences for the behaviour. But I think, if we're looking at conflict, it can be labelled bullying when it is not.
I think two things that you said really hit home for me. The first one was that bullying, using the label bullying, is a really good way to make HR departments sit up and take notice. They will take you seriously if you use that word, because they have, risk-averse tendencies, and that's something that could create a big risk to the organisation. But the other thing I think that connects with that is that if conflict isn't managed well in the early stages, it can turn into bullying. And so that might be another organisational problem. If they don't have ways to support staff to address conflict early on, they may be setting themselves up for later bullying as a result of those kind of conflict escalations.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of research that talks about bullying doesn't just happen out of the blue. It happens, it's an escalating process. And the research that I have done, and a lot of the research that's been done at the University of South Australia as well, and the bullying research overseas, all talks about the climate of the organisation is a really big predictor of workplace bullying. And there's a group of researchers at the University of South Australia that's led by Maureen Dollard. And if you Google psychosocial safety climate and bullying along with Maureen Dollard's name, you should get a whole lot of articles. And the psychosocial safety climate really talks about, in the organisation, is poor behaviour rewarded? Is it tolerated? Or is it actually punished? Are there ways of addressing poor behaviours within the organisation to stop them from escalating? Are there a number of conflict management systems? And is there training there available? So looking for managers and staff. So looking at all of those things to examine a psychosocial safety climate. And Maureen Dollard has also got what she calls the workplace safety barometer that you may have heard of, to look at psychological safety in the workplace. The other one with the psychosocial safety climate is the work design. In what way is work designed to actually assist with conflict management? And from if I look at it from a council perspective in terms of my role now, even simple things like having dinner or having a meal before a council meeting, putting that into the design, actually assists with people having a proper blood sugar level and not getting angry because their sugar drops or they're feeling hungry. So work design, making sure that workers actually have lunch, that they leave at the right time, and managers and staff in the upper hierarchy, including the CEO, actually mirror that. They have their lunch, they leave, they don't come in on weekends, they have downtime. So those sorts of things are really important, because if you've got work where it's extremely competitive, it's extremely hierarchical, the workers don't feel as though they belong or they have input into the organisation, that competitive behaviour is rewarded, and they know that there's no point complaining about anything because their complaints either won't be taken seriously, they'll be told to, pull their pants up and get a life. That is a recipe for workplace bullying. It's a recipe for sexual harassment if it's happening in a very male-dominated industry, and for discrimination, because people with different characteristics will be excluded from that competitive culture. When we're looking at bullying, one of the difficulties is that it doesn't just come out of the blue. You can't just go in and mediate a complaint of bullying or investigate a complaint of bullying and then leave it thinking everything's going to be okay, because the culture of the organisation has actually assisted in that behaviour reaching that level that it's needed an external person to come in and address it.
Yeah, and I see that a lot. People think about bullying as the bully's the problem. We have this problematic person in the organisation. If we just punish them or ideally remove them from the organisation, everything will be fine. But what you're saying is the bullying is often a symptom of underlying structural problems in the organisation or cultural problems in the organisation that allow it to happen. And dealing with the individual bully doesn't necessarily deal with those other factors. So you may get it happening again, but with a different bully, a different person.
Absolutely. Those systemic structural factors are really important. And some of the risks are, organisations that start off quite small. So perhaps they've got a value statement, and that's about it, if that. And then they grow very rapidly, and they haven't got the systems in place to manage those sorts of behaviours. It may be the person who started the organisation doesn't have an HR or an industrial background, so they're not sure about what they can do or they can't do. They may actually feel threatened by the bully or the person perpetrating the behaviour themselves, because I know that, even though I'm experienced and I'm a pretty strong person, when you are faced with somebody who is extremely aggressive and who is threatening, you put on a brave face, and it is very difficult for managers. And managers can, there's that flight or fight. And so managers tend to either ignore it if they are too threatened by it, they'll ignore it, hope it goes away, or otherwise they will become aggressive in themselves and they'll become very, very, very one-sided, not actually approach the issue properly. So it is quite an issue for growing organisations.
One of the things that I see happen a lot is that conflict resolution practitioners are called into an organisation to do one of two different things. Often they're called in to do conflict management coaching. I've been asked on a number of occasions to conflict management coach somebody who they see as a problem employee, often is engaging in bullying behaviours, and they think somehow I'm going to come in and magically fix them and the problem's going to go away. The other thing that sometimes happens is either instead of or before a formal investigation, a line manager thinks, we'll just get the person who's been accused of bullying and the target together, they'll have a conversation and they can just sort it out. So they think mediation might fix it. When you hear those kinds of typical responses, we just coach the bully or we just do mediation between the accused bully and the target, what sort of things could go wrong in that kind of response?
It's two things, and I agree, both of those happen. And I recently had a scenario when I was asked to go and do some coaching with somebody who had been accused of bullying, and they appeared to be very engaged. They that they understood what we were talking about. They didn't do any of the homework that had been set for them. One of the things that we talked about was ways to write emails that respond to emails that wasn't aggressive. This person would send lots of long emails and write red letters and things like that. And we'd had a discussion about that, and she was going to send me some emails prior to sending them just to check. That didn't happen. And then the feedback that I received later was that nothing changed. So sometimes people have got very little insight into the behaviours that they exhibit, And those sorts of things actually do need to be, that's where you need your manager to be involved with, rather than an outside conflict coach as such, so that your manager can say, look, this is not acceptable, and there can be consequences for the poor behaviour. One of the frustrations that I have is, I think, as a conflict management specialist, when I'm brought into an organisation to deal with just one person or two people in a mediation, that there isn't that wider perspective in terms of what is contributing to this behaviour. And it's almost like the manager wants to wash their hands of it and bring me in. Moira will fix it, or Samantha will fix it. And that is just not realistic, I don't think. There has been a lot of debate about whether mediation is appropriate for bullying or not. I think that it needs to be assessed on the merits of the actual case. I think there are some times when, especially with that escalated bullying, and if it's more low-grade bullying, mediation actually can be appropriate. And it can actually teach the two parties about getting below those positions into the interests and looking at what are the actual issues and helping them solve it themselves. Now, for bullying that is absolutely targeting somebody, where somebody is damaged psychologically or physically by the behaviour, if it's ongoing behaviour, if it's really victimising and targeting, I don't think mediation is appropriate. I think that there needs to be an investigation. In saying that, there may be times following an investigation and disciplinary action where you may want to bring the two parties together, because really mediation is not about establishing facts. It's whether it happened or it didn't happen. If there's an investigation first and the facts are established, there may be disciplinary action taken, and then the parties are brought together to look at the future. They may discuss the past in the mediation, but they're looking at the future in terms of their future relationship, getting back to work, how they're going to behave, those sorts of things. Mediation may be appropriate then. But one of the things that I do talk about, and I have written quite a lot about this, is I like with bullying to take what I call a risk management approach to mediation. So you're not just dealing with the two parties, but you're also asking the parties themselves and involving them in this. What are the risks within the organisation that may have contributed to this behaviour occurring and escalating? So, have there been lots of changes in management? Do you feel supported? Have you had training? Has your manager had training? Is it a very competitive environment? What sort of hours do you work? How do you feel about the workplace? And then, so that's actually making an assessment of what's going on around that behaviour and around those people. And then I would, with their permission, feed that back to HR so that they can actually then work on the more systemic issues that have come to light. The other thing with those sorts of mediations, with the permission of the parties, the settlement is given to HR. Normally the settlement is confidential between the parties, but if you gain their permission, the settlement agreement can be given back to HR for HR to follow up to ensure that it is being adhered to. So there may be slightly different ways that you do a mediation that has been labelled bullying that you would necessarily with a pure conflict mediation. But you do need to be very careful, and I do make it very clear to the participants that at any time I feel as the mediator that somebody is being victimised or that it's not appropriate for the mediation to continue, it will stop, and I will let HR know that behaviour will be reported to them. And I put that in the agreement to mediate so that both parties are very clear on that. And that is, mediation is confidential, except for that, and obviously mandatory reporting requirements. But I think as long as you're, as a mediator, are very transparent about what won't be reported, and it's actually written into the mediation agreement, and you look at the systemic issues as well, I think that is appropriate. Once again, not all complaints labelled bullying are appropriate for mediation, but I don't agree with the premise that no bullying complaints are appropriate for mediation. mediation can be used for bullying, but it needs to be structured around the safety of the participants and looking at the confidentiality. And you have to be very transparent about that.
Mm. One of the things that I hear a little bit is in bullying situations, it's not great to get the parties together because there's a risk that can sort of perpetuate bullying behaviour, or it can make the target feel even more unsafe, even with a facilitator present, because the bully is often very clever in the way they go about the behaviour. And so coaching might be a useful alternative where you could work with the alleged bully and the target separately to try and get them in a space where they can manage the situation better. What's your response to that as a potential different alternative to mediation?
Look, I think even when there's conflict and there's no bullying, it's not bullying per se, there's conflict enough that one person is feeling very aggrieved or both parties are feeling very aggrieved, they will be uncomfortable. And I say to people, it's quite normal to feel uncomfortable coming into a mediation situation. You're facing somebody you don't like. You're facing somebody who has made you feel uncomfortable, who's made you feel anxious, who's made you feel really angry, even if it's not bullying. So if it's labelled bullying, that just adds another emotive layer to it. Conflict coaching, I think, can be really helpful prior to mediation and getting the parties ready for the mediation. I think as a mediator, you have to be very careful not to have the parties feel that you are siding with them. And as a conflict coach, you're developing a relationship with whoever you are coaching. So that can be a tricky balance to have in relation to that. Whether or not you have a different conflict coach to a mediator is something that people need to consider. But I think that there needs to be a very good initial assessment as to whether it's appropriate for mediation. I mean, certainly you could do shuttle mediations, but I think if people are so worried about getting together that you have to do a shuttle mediation between the parties, I don't think for a workplace mediation or a bullying mediation that's actually going to work. There comes a time where you say, look, mediation's actually not going to work here. And that may be part of your BATNA and WATNA. So you say to the parties, look, okay, so your BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement, if we don't have mediation, what's the best thing that can happen? What's the worst thing that can happen? So you say that to, say, the respondent, the bully. What's the best thing that can happen? Oh, it can go away. What's the worst thing that can happen? Oh, there may be an investigation and disciplinary action. Okay, what do you think is realistic? What would you prefer? Oh, I'd maybe prefer to try and sort it out. Okay, so then you say to the complainant or the target, what's the best thing that can happen? Or he can get hung, drawn and quartered. How realistic is that? Do you think that is going to happen? What are the costs to you emotionally with going to court or whatever? What's the time frame? What's the impact on you? You'll need to face them. What sort of witnesses have you got? Is it just a he says, she says sort of thing? And then, what's the worst thing that can happen? Oh, well, he just goes away with nothing. Okay, well, what's the middle ground? And that may be mediation. And what are you worried about mediation? Well, I'm worried about having to face him. What is it about facing him that worries you? Will he swear at me? Will he do X, Y, Z? Okay, that's where it's my job as a mediator to make sure that he's not going to, and that there's ground rules. And I do apologise for saying he and she. That's that's definitely not always the case, especially in bullying. So really establishing those ground rules and talking to them at the beginning about what might happen down, the WATNAs and the BATNAs, about actually going to mediation and what the alternatives are, and looking at that through a realistic lens.
that you said earlier, and that's been my experience as well, when you're working with someone who is engaging in bullying behaviours, they're often very smart about it and they can play the game. You know, in coaching or pre-mediation conversations, they're saying all the right things, but then it doesn't turn into action. There's no incentive to change, whether it's a motivation or a threat of punishment. So they say all the right things, they engage in the mediation, they come across very understanding and amenable to cooperation, but at the end of that process, nothing actually happens.
I've had the experience of that. I've also had the experience of a relationship being built and understanding being built. And I just recall a mediation I did that was labelled bullying. And the manager came to me, saw her socially a few months later, and she said, "You know that mediation that you did?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, you know, the two of them are as thick as thieves now. They're getting on really well," which is quite unusual, but it does happen. I think this is where your outcome and your settlement agreement is really important. If it is a bullying complaint and you have put in your mediation, the settlement agreement will go to HR and will be followed up. I think that is really important to do, so that if it is breached and if the behaviour continues, then HR can actually go down an investigation or use disciplinary action in relation to that. Because mediation is really about no blame, it's about educating, it's about getting an increased understanding, and it's about looking about in the future, what can we do differently so that this doesn't happen again. If it is somebody who you described who is saying all the right things and doing all the right things, but then afterwards continues to victimize somebody, then there will be an agreement there where they have possibly said, they've apologized, they won't do what they had done previously. That's actually a record of ongoing inappropriate behavior that can be used in the future to inform an investigation or disciplinary action. But it needs the agreement of both parties before it can actually go to HR.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is some advice perhaps for people who might be put in that situation as a potential mediator is that you need to be very careful to balance what you might normally offer in terms of confidentiality with the need for some transparency and accountability where there's potentially a bullying situation, because confidentiality sometimes can protect the bullying or remove incentives for sticking to, agreed better behaviours. So you might need to moderate your standard confidentiality agreements in those sorts of situations.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. But once again, I'd emphasise that both parties really need to know about that, and both parties need to agree to that. Otherwise, you are undermining the mediation process.
Yeah, so that needs to happen up front, not at the end of the mediation. Yeah, okay.
No, that needs to happen up front. The other thing that can help is that the target may want to have support people. So you can have support people in the mediation if that is required. Sometimes you might find that the perpetrator is particularly suspicious and there's a conspiracy theory attached to anything. And so having another person there may be helpful for them as well. But the support people really need to know their role only as support. They don't talk, they don't contribute to the mediation. They may talk about it. You go into private sessions with the particular party, but during the mediation, they are only there for support. And that may offer the target some reassurance as well.
Would you ever have the line manager involved, as part of the sort of system, or the person who controls the incentives or disincentives for certain behaviour?
No, I haven't done that, because that can be seen as siding with one or the other, coming into more performance management or investigation, establishing facts around behaviour. It is really important, though, that any agreement that is reached is okay with the line manager and is okay with HR. So, for example, a mediation that I did a number of years ago now, one of the requests from the complainant, who had been on sick leave for some time, was to have her sick leave reimbursed. And so we had to clear that with HR prior to that actually being part of the mediation agreement, and HR were happy for that to occur.
So if you were mentoring a junior conflict resolution practitioner, let's say somebody who offers mediation and conflict management coaching, they've had a little bit of experience, they're going into the workplace, what advice would you give them about how to manage a situation where they're called in to provide some kind of conflict resolution service and there's potential bullying? We're not really sure if it's actual bullying yet, but it's certainly a name that's been used to describe the behaviours. What advice would you give?
It can be a really tricky situation. And so I can understand why they would be a bit apprehensive. I'd say take away those labels, look at the behaviours, look at what's happening within the organisation. And if you do not think that it's appropriate for conflict coaching or for mediation, then it's really important to actually say that. You might have pressure from the organisation in relation to carrying out a mediation, but you might, after you've done an assessment of everything that's going on, you might think, no, this is not appropriate. I had a few years ago, I was asked to do a mediation, and when I spoke to the parties and then I ended up speaking to other people about what was going on and discovered that this particular team, the whole team was in significant conflict. And it wasn't just the two parties. And so I said that this was not appropriate just for a mediation between the two parties, but there needed to be some work done with the whole team around some issues that were going on there, which were long-standing issues. Just doing a mediation wouldn't have worked.
How do you sort of negotiate with the sponsor or the person in the organisation who's called you in? How do you approach them to get information that's, about what's going on in the organisation that's beyond what the two parties directly involved or the parties who you've been called in to mediate between? How do you get access to information that's broader than that about the system and the organisational structural matters?
I talk to them about, especially if they've used the word bullying, I would say to them, one of the things that we do know is that bullying doesn't just occur in isolation, that it's contributed to by a number of things. And taking a systems approach, it's really important not to just focus on the two individuals, but taking a risk management approach. What's going on? It's important to look at what's going on in the organisation that may have contributed to this. And so I would have a discussion with that manager or with HR or whoever, as you said, the sponsor, whoever's employed me, to look at some of those issues within the organisation that I talked about earlier on. How competitive is it? What's going on? Have there been lots of changes? Has there been training? Are the managers actually, is the manager new? Has the manager been promoted because of technical expertise or because of their people expertise? And, one of the difficulties is often managers are really good engineers or nurses or IT professionals who become managers because of their technical expertise, but they really don't understand the importance of working with people and spending, a significant amount of their time dealing with the people problems. And so that can contribute to things. So I talk to HR about that and say that if I'm going to do the mediation, it's really important that these other issues are also taken into account, not by me as the mediator, but by HR, to prevent this sort of thing happening again. May or may not,
Yeah, and it's always more expensive, isn't it, to deal with some of those systemic issues than just get two people in a room together. One of the things that I do a fair bit of is working with those people who have been promoted based on technical expertise and suddenly find that a large part of their job is managing conflict of the people below them, and so they need some support. If I was working with someone in that role and there's a history of bullying type behaviours in their team, what would be some of the things that you think would be helpful for a manager to learn about or pay attention to, or what sort of skills would be useful for them to develop so that they would be better able to manage bullying that might, arise or potentially arise in their teams?
The manager or the person in charge sets that culture. So it's really important for the manager to be very aware of their own behaviour. They are no longer part of the the group that can gossip together, that can bitch about senior management, that can tell the jokes that are slightly inappropriate. They have to be very, very aware of their behaviour and set the scene so that when they see those inappropriate jokes or the bitching about management, they can actually deal with them. You know, if you're part of that, if you're part of the group and doing that, you can't actually deal with them. But, you know, if you hear a joke, you just say, look, that's not appropriate here. If you hear people bitching about management, you say, look, let's go and have a talk about this. I heard you saying X, Y, Z, you know, have you got an issue? You know, what is your issue? And then so developing relationships with your team members and actually modeling appropriate behaviour is really, really important. And I think having a mentor, as if you're a new manager and a middle manager, having a mentor from somebody above you that you can talk to is really important, because you can no longer talk to your mate next door and bitch about, you know, the director, because you are part of that management team. And so being a middle manager can be a very lonely experience. And so it's really important to have somebody that you are able to talk to, that you are able to get some, and you can talk to truthfully. You can say to them, you know, I'm not coping, or I don't know how to do this, or I've had a really bad day, or I'm not getting any of my technical work done because everyone keeps on coming through the door. How do you manage this? You know, I've got somebody who's always on sick leave or always late, or comes to work at 9 o'clock on the dot, but then spends half an hour eating their breakfast in the kitchen. Is that something that I need to get on top of? Or how do you manage that sort of thing? Because as a manager, you don't want to be policing everything. You want to develop good relationships. You want to be able to support your team. You want to be able to advance your team and advance people in the team. But you also have a role in developing the culture on the team, which may be saying no to some things. And culture takes a long time to change. Patience is really important, I'd say, to new managers who want to get in there and change things straight away. Just, you know, role model, patient, form relationships, pick your battles, pick your fires, and get some assistance from somebody higher up that you can talk to.
I come into an organisation as a new manager and I know there's been a history of bullying in the team or in the organisation. What would be some things that should be on my to-do list to try and improve the culture to prevent those sorts of bullying situations happening again? What could I do as a senior manager to try and start turning that culture around?
I think having the conversation. So this is where I would work with somebody, you know, like you, like me, or an outside person coming in and starting that conversation about what sort of team do we want. There may be history that you can't talk about. There may be history that needs to be talked about because people are traumatised. So having a series of workshops, not just a one-off and forget it, but a series that build on each workshop, that look at what sort of, so you get your team values and what sort of team do we want to have, and then offer the manager some coaching, which may be around conflict management, maybe around other issues, and there may be team members as well that do want to have some individual coaching on how to manage conflict better. Team members that the manager thinks, you know, you might go somewhere, I'm offering you a little bit more, so that you are actually one of the champions within the team that can support that culture. So I think that's a good way to start.
Would it ever be appropriate to do coaching work with somebody who's the target of bullying behaviour? Is that something that could be helpful, or could that potentially be dangerous?
No, I think that could be helpful. It's teaching new skills. When you look at the organisation's usual complaint process, you know, it starts off with self-help on one side, then manager, and then HR, and then investigation, and then outside agencies. That self-help, if somebody was able to help themselves, they wouldn't have come to see you anyway. And so conflict management coaching, I think, can be very helpful. One, to help someone to understand why a person might be acting that way, you know, and no one's perfect. And, you know, it may be labelled bullying, but it may be both people acting badly. And as a target, I'm certainly going to be very defensive, and my behaviour is not going to be lovely behaviour. So it might help me look at my behaviour and how my behaviour is also escalating the issue. Probably need to be done sensitively. Yes, I think that you can use conflict coaching to assist targets to understand behaviour better and to develop strategies that are specific to what's going on, that they may be able to put into place that they hadn't actually thought about before, so that they can help resolve some of it.
Why is conflict management so challenging in bullying situations?
I think conflict management in bullying situations is really challenging because the term bullying makes it much more adversarial, and the term bullying polarizes the parties. And so as a conflict management coach or as a mediator, you're coming into a situation where the parties are very polarized in terms of victim perpetrator. And it's really important to be able to unpack that before you can actually start to work on what's actually going on underneath. Because if you think of the term bullying, there's all sorts of, biases associated with that. And, if I labelled somebody a bully, there's the unconscious biases about this person not being a very nice person, this person targeting someone and victimizing somebody, and this narcissist and the psychopath, and you just name it, when in fact you get underneath it and this person is really frightened for some reason. They're worried about their job. They're worried about their reputation. They don't cope with conflict very well. They've got a whole lot of other things going on, and they have lashed out. And their lashing out is their way of coping. But their lashing out is actually injuring somebody and is contributing to what the target is calling bullying. And so you need to get beyond that label and actually find out what is going on. And then you can start to work with someone. So I think that's one of the reasons why it is so hard, because people are so defensive.
One of the things that often happens if someone makes a bullying claim, that there's the reverse allegation. No, I'm the victim here. You're the bully.
Absolutely. You find that often.
Yeah, and what you're saying is let's move beyond the labels and let's deal with each of them as individuals with their own particular insecurities, vulnerabilities, needs, history, and work with them as people rather than as the bully and the target.
I think that that's important, but in saying that, you can get real bullies who are targeting and humiliating and victimizing somebody, and so you need to also remember that their behavior is very injurious, if that's the right word, and you do have to deal with that. And I think if you've got somebody like that, I don't think it is appropriate for mediation or for conflict coaching for the perpetrator. I really worry about the way that labels are used to put people in boxes, and I think that we really need to get underneath that and look at that. So I've been becoming more interested, and I've been doing a little bit of work lately around power and the unconscious biases that are associated with power, because power is another fascinating subject. When we're in positions of power, we actually don't realise our power, and we operate just thinking we're ourselves. But in fact, power gives us such immense privilege that we can often, without meaning to, abuse that, because we're not aware of it. And so I'm becoming quite interested, and I've been doing some work with a particular organisation throughout Australia looking at power, which is, I think, very interesting.
Yeah, and power is such an important component in the whole concept of bullying. And what I remember this quote, I don't know why it stuck in my mind. I think it was just because it was a really funny line, but I think they were talking about the problem with managers not addressing problem behaviours early enough, and so setting up this kind of environment where bullying is perpetuated. And they said a lot of the times the managers are scared to use the power that they have, and that sometimes what needed to happen is the line managers needed to recognise and own the fact that they are actually ridiculously in charge, that they do actually have the power, to set criteria for workplace culture and for appropriate behaviour and impose consequences. And a lot of the time, the conditions that set up the environment where bullying could take place is because people were nervous about using their power. And it doesn't mean abusing it, but using it for the right reasons in the right ways, which you spoke a lot about today.
Absolutely. So people need to know, I think line managers need to know that they actually have that power, but also people that have quite, immense power need to know, who just take it for granted, need to know that they have to consciously be aware that people can't say no, or people won't say no, or people won't tell them they're behaving badly because of the power that they hold. And so they have to keep themselves in check and develop some more emotional intelligence about their own power because they've just taken it for granted. So power is absolutely interesting.
I wonder if some people who get labelled bullies are in that situation where they don't recognise that they're using power in an appropriate way, or that other people are seeing them as someone powerful and therefore required to do things that they're not comfortable with and not able to speak up. I wonder if that can be a condition that sets someone up to be a bully, not recognising their power and how they might be using it over others.
Look, absolutely. And I think there's a good example from my own experience. So as a mayor now, I preside over council meetings. And one of the things that councillors can do is there's a motion on the table, but they start talking about all sorts of other things and go off, on a stream of consciousness. And my job is to bring them back to the motion. So to start off with, I would be like, councillor, you're not talking about the motion, come back to the motion. And it started to come back to me that the councillors found that they felt that I was being really, really nasty and that I was having a go at them. And I said, well, no, that's just my job, and you're going off on a tangent. I have to bring you back. But they were saying, but the way that you're doing it. And so I reflected on this. And I think as conflict coaches and conflict managers, it's really important to reflect on our own behaviour. And I reflected on it and I thought, yeah, well, maybe they are right. And so now what I tend to do is I go, Councillor X, I know you're really interested in what you're talking about, and it's a really important issue that we need to debate at a workshop. But at the moment, we need to stick to the motion on the table, okay? So that's just a slight difference in terms of the way that I use my power. And I think also because when I first became mayor, presiding over a council meeting and we get filmed, we have people that come in and film us, which are quite antagonistic. You can be quite nervous because there's lots going on. So I tended to be very, this is what I do. You're speaking out of turn, stop it. I would play the policewoman. Rather than now, I try and soften. It's still the same thing, come back to the motion, but I try and soften it and do it in a way that isn't going to make the other person feel aggrieved or feel attacked or feel defensive. Even though they don't agree with me, it's a better way. So I think that we need to reflect on how we do things. And people in positions of power, and being mayor, that is a position of power, although I find that strange, but it is. I have to be much more aware of my behaviour and the way that I come across than I've ever had to before. And it's been a learning process. So people need to learn, and just because at the beginning I was much more abrupt, didn't mean to say that I was a bully, but it meant that I was much more abrupt and I needed to learn to soften my approach.
Yeah, and I think it's a nice example of how that behaviour, you weren't intending to be abrupt or intending to bully people, but that's how some people might receive it. And that's another nice example of sometimes when people engage in bullying behaviour, it's certainly not their intention to intimidate or harass or humiliate people. And sometimes those sorts of conversations that we might facilitate could make them understand that, to realise that despite their good intentions, the execution of their behaviours was having an unintended impact that was not helpful. And that can be enough to motivate people to change, as you just explained you did. Yeah.
Absolutely, because I think when we become defensive ourselves, when we are in positions where we're not familiar with, if we have to performance manage a new staff member and we're not used to performance managing somebody, we become very focused and very narrow in our approach. And so we will be more abrupt. We will be much more to the point rather than actually still saying the same thing, but finding a way to say it in a manner that's more supportive rather than being, getting somebody's back up.
A lot of people who are in fairly senior positions feel like they're being bullied up to. So their subordinates are bullying up, and they find that in theory they've got all this power, but in reality it doesn't feel like that. Have you had experience, or do you have any suggestions or comments about this phenomenon of bullying up?
Yes, there's been a lot of research done. Sarah Branch from, I think, Griffith University did some research in terms of upwards bullying, and it is a lot more common than we actually think. The difficulty is that in the literature, most of the literature around bullies has been done by unions or by focusing very much on employees rather than focusing on senior management. And so most of the bullying literature that we have is from that perspective. And that's one of the reasons that I actually interviewed bullies as part of my PhD, because we didn't know anything about bullies, why they did that or what was going on. But anyway, that's another story. But it's funny that managers and very senior people who are bullied, and I've seen some horrendous bullying directed towards very senior people. It tends to happen more in groups, so that mobbing rather than an individual. So if I complain, someone's a director, if I complain to the CEO about my staff bullying me, they're going to think that I can't manage conflict. It's a career limiting move. And so they don't complain about it, when in fact the behaviour is just absolutely appalling. And I can remember in my psychology practice seeing somebody who was an extremely senior person in a public service job and was being bullied by a group of people and would vomit before going to work, was just in tears in my office, not coping. She said, I've spent my whole life with my career, going up my career. I don't want to leave, because the whole organisation was just awful. We talk about a risk management approach and what's going on around. It was just awful. And so I said to her, look, my advice to you would be to leave. You're not going to win or achieve anything. You're getting really sick. She said, no, I'm not going to leave. A few months later, she got a secondment somewhere else in a very similar position. And she said that she felt better. She was back enjoying work, loving her work. But she was bullied really badly from a small group of people and bullied up. And she couldn't talk to anybody about it.
Are there any options, or is leaving, kind of, unfortunately, the best choice you could make in that situation?
Well, if nothing's going to change, if you cannot change the situation that you're in and it's making you ill, then I don't see any other option than leaving. There may be other, individuals might find other options, and part of that job might be exploring what are the other options. And it was just coincidental that this other option came up which suited her, because she didn't think that there were any. But, that bullying was really contributing to significant mental health issues and physical health issues too. I think if you're vomiting before coming to work because you have to face a group of people in a meeting each day, it's just dreadful. So upwards bullying does occur, and certainly senior managers need significant support around how to manage that. I think it's really important that they receive that support.
Theory, she could have made a formal allegation of bullying and had an investigation, but was the thing that prevents people in that senior role doing that, is it the fear of seeming incompetent as a manager, or not? Is that what tends to be the sticking point?
That was the big issue, seeming to be incompetent, putting in a complaint. That she said that if I put in a complaint, my public service career would be over. And so I'm not going to put in a complaint. So it is, there are issues, and I think there needs to be a lot more research done on upwards bullying and the impact of upwards bullying on the careers of senior staff, because senior staff often won't complain about it.
I want to say thank you very much. I know you're very, very busy at the moment, but it's been lovely to spend an hour with you talking about this. I'm sure all the viewers are going to find some very useful information in there and some things that they can follow up on to find out more. At the very least, they should all have a look at this book, which covers a lot of the content in more detail.
I'm trying to do an edition 2 at the moment, but I've just been so busy.
Ask that.
Yeah, there has been significant changes since that book was published, in terms of bullying now being covered by the industrial relations legislation, and we know a lot more about bullying. So, and of course the sexual harassment and the Me Too movement. There's a lot more information on that. So I am working on it, but as you said, I am very busy at the moment.
I don't know how you have time to do anything, but it would be a very valuable contribution, because there is actually surprisingly very little out there, other than if you trawl through all the academic journals, which practitioners don't have time or necessarily the skills or the access to do. So a book like yours is a really powerful contribution to the field. So yeah, I'm sure we're all cheering for you to find some time in the background there.
Thank you. And if people do want to get the book, they can go to Australian Academic Press and get it. And I think it might actually be available online now.
Moira, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Lovely talking to you.